Let's take a look at the first story of this op-ed from Joe Concha over at The Hill. He says Biden's poor TV ratings against Trump is exactly what this administration wants. I don't agree, but the point Joe is making is, I believe it's a fair point, though I do disagree. He basically says, we know that Trump was just desperate for ratings, and he didn't say desperate, but like bragging about how good his ratings were. And then we see Joe Biden. His ratings are in the gutter. Nobody wants to watch the guy. Nobody wants to watch CNN or MSNBC because they built a network on hating Trump, and Biden just ain't it. But he goes on to mention that with all of this massive spending, he says $1.9 trillion for COVID relief, $2.25 trillion in infrastructure. With nobody paying attention to what Biden's doing, he can just keep doing these things and no one will stop him. I don't like the argument because who is going to stop him anyway? Mitch McConnell, he's not going to do anything. And all they really need the Democrats for is the rage vote. And then, like clockwork, the traditional liberals go back to sleep. I experienced it in 2008. We're watching it happen now. This is good news for disaffected liberals, moderates, conservatives, Trump supporters, and whoever else on the right. Because this means that with liberals going to sleep declaring victory, but only on a very, very slim victory, well, the Republicans in 2022 will likely take the House, and maybe even in 2024, we'll see what happens. But I wonder what y'all think about Joe Biden's inability to make anybody care about what he's doing.
I think it's actually really interesting. I think we saw a bunch of that after the election, right? There were like 2 weeks where it seemed like we were just all going to celebrate Biden's victory, that the country was going to open up. It seemed like that was the deal that was being made, that the nation was being held hostage to a Biden victory. And then, sure enough, they came crashing back down and locking everything up again, which actually seemed way worse than the first time. But I do think that liberals have pretty well gone to sleep because they figure that they've got their guy in. Their guy is going to do the right thing. And that's that. They were so invested in hating Trump that anything that's not Trump they think is good. And so they're not actually applying any critical thinking power to these policies that are being enacted. They're not looking at what horror it's going to implement in the U.S.
I wonder if they ever actually cared at all. I know people who have no business being in politics, like people who didn't vote in 08, 12 or 16, who all of a sudden were like filming videos of themselves where they're like, I got to put my ballot. They're like, are you doing your duty with your ballot? And I'm like, dude, you have no idea what you're talking about. You're just doing this because the guy on the TV said to do it. Is that really, it's tribal. So after that trend, what's the next trendy thing to do? It certainly is not Joe Biden. No one cares about him.
No one cares about Joe Biden, but I do think it's interesting too. We had in the fall, we had AOC, we had Bernie Sanders and other progressives complaining that Joe Biden wasn't going to be far left enough, that he wasn't going to install the progressive agenda. And now we're seeing them basically celebrating. You have Hillary Clinton saying he's doing a bang-up job. You have AOC saying that he's really being much more collaborative with progressives. And I think that the conservatives that held their nose and voted for Joe Biden, I think they were played. They believed that Joe Biden was just going to be ineffectual. You had Bill Kristol talking about how this was going to be the way to install and create a new conservatism, that all of this stuff was going to be easier for conservatives with Trump out of the way. And instead, they were completely steamrolled. It was like a total bait and switch. They voted for a moderate guy who wasn't going to do anything. And instead, they got this progressive guy who's just spending all the money and then some.
But he's still not progressive enough for the actual socialists.
Well, AOC seems happy about him so far. She said the other day before his State of the Union there.
But does AOC actually have principles, or is she just like a stop? She's like a pressure relief valve for the Democratic Party. So that in the event the woke left becomes too disaffected, she then goes like, wee, and they're like, oh, we're satisfied again. So.
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure if she has any principles. She goes on for long periods of time on Instagram Live, and we can try and sort it out, although so much of it seems like just straight nonsense.
There are rumors that because New York is losing a district, they're going to get rid of hers. Have you heard that?
I have heard that.
Is that true? Or is that just
I don't know. I mean,
wishful thinking?
Whoever's in charge would get to redraw the districts, and the Democrats are in charge, so they could redraw the districts, and they could draw out a Republican district instead.
Right. Yeah, that makes way more sense.
Yeah.
I mean, AOC has fallen in line.
Mm-hmm.
She like I said, she's she's a pressure release valve for the Democratic Party. The progressives get too angry. She comes in and she does her finger snap and then
Right.
acts like Nancy Pelosi should get votes and then votes for Nancy Pelosi while pretending like she doesn't like Nancy
Right.
Pelosi.
She gets her whole crew on board.
I don't think Joe Biden is a socialist. The socialists, the actual Bernie DSA types, think Joe Biden is a fascist, just not as much of a fascist as Trump. And I'm like, okay, maybe, whatever. I'm sure Joe Biden is not a good guy. He's corrupt. He's crooked. He's pro-war. All these really awful things. So sure, I guess I'll give him that one. But to say he's not enacting far left policies when he's just like money printer go burr, just cranking out the bills to pay for stuff.
Is. He very clearly is.
He rescinded the executive orders on critical race theory.
He sure did. And now they have a new thing going through to more like mandate critical race theory in schools.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, and that's pretty weird. And you had McConnell coming out
I'm sorry.
against
You mean
it.
to teach Black history?
No.
No. Reuters says it's about teaching Black history.
We have Black history. Black history is essential. The civil rights movement is, of course, a monumental achievement in American history. But that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about like...
You mean Reuters lied to me? Did you see the headline from Reuters?
I'm not going to say that. I don't want to get fact checked.
Reuters said Republicans asked Biden to end his divisive policy on teaching Black history. It is the most insane propaganda.
I agree.
Wow.
And this stuff has been coming up in schools for a while. I think it's only recently, though, that parents have been seeing it. And that's why people have been able to speak out against it. Oddly enough, it's because of remote schooling that parents were able to see this stuff. I know that happened in my house, right? So my son kicked out of school March 16th with all of the other 1.1 million school children in New York City. And hardly any of them are back still. I think we recently reopened sort of middle and high schools, but there's like 300,000 kids back in schools, basically, at the last number that I checked, which was maybe a month ago, actually. But once my son came home and I started seeing what was going on in the classroom, it wasn't really a big deal until after George Floyd was killed. And then I heard his teachers say that they were going to have a day talking about, I think it was a day talking about white privilege, and another day talking about, what happened and everything. So I set up my voice recorder to just record what was going on his call. And I recorded hours of this conversation where the white kids were basically, he was actually the only white kid in the class. So where the white kids were basically told that they didn't even know that there was racism in their family, that their parents didn't know that they were racist, that their grandparents didn't know that they were racist. And I'm looking at our family, and I'm sure lots of parents did this as well. My son's grandmother was a public defender in Philadelphia. She defended MOVE members. I don't know if you guys know who that is. She defended... Do
you want to briefly describe MOVE?
So MOVE was a Black nationalist organization. They were in West Philadelphia. They were targeted by the FBI and the city. They were eventually bombed in this horrible situation. I think it was 85, maybe. They were bombed by a Black mayor who teamed up with the FBI. Wow. So
is that your mom who defended?
No. That is my son's dad's mom. Yeah, and she
defended
passed.
The MOVE members.
She defended. Yeah, I believe she defended Eddie Africa.
Wow.
Yeah.
But the teacher said that this is a racist person.
This is a racist family. My grandmother was a public school teacher in Brownsville, Brooklyn, in the 40s. Her parents were immigrants. But I mean, it doesn't even matter what your background is, right? I mean, the idea that a teacher should be telling you that your grandparents are probably racist and that they don't know it and that you don't know it and that this is just the passed down legacy through your family on the basis of your skin color is absurd. That a teacher should be telling a kid that anything is a product of skin color or race is completely anathema to the civil rights movement that is what should be being taught, right?
You know what's really funny about critical race theory? When you look up the Wikipedia for it, they have to define what white supremacy means because it doesn't mean what people think it means. So It actually says CRT is loosely unified by two common themes. First, that white supremacy exists and maintains power through the law. They then add in parentheses after white supremacy, societal racism.
Right.
Because in the language of the cult members, when they say white supremacy, they don't mean what 98% of Americans understand it to be, that A white supremacist is somebody who believes white people are superior or supreme. They've just changed it to be now just objectivity and history and
being
math
on time. Being on time as white supremacist.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's sort of interesting too, because the new definition of white supremacy means that there can be no way to educate yourself out of it. There's no way to have forgiveness. There's no reconciliation at all. It's a permanent condition until, and looking at something like systemic racism, basically the entire society needs to be dismantled before that can be repaired. And we're looking at a set of theories that the people who support them, the idea would be you have to dismantle society, but they're not offering anything to rebuild it on, right? It's just a completely destructive idea.
I agree. And I often refer to it as a chaotic and destructive force because there's no real rules. Like, is women offensive today? Because you got to say Wimixin, but then Wimixin is offensive because it excludes certain women. And I think maybe the reality is there may be competing interests in terms of what comes next. So the one thing they all agree on is destroy the system.
Destroy the system.
But I do think many of those who claim to be trained Marxists don't want to tell you what their actual solution is, because people would revolt if they found out what these people were planning. And so they say, we got to tear down white supremacy. And everyone goes, that sounds pretty good to me. And then, first of all, they don't mean literal white supremacy. They mean some ridiculous, nonsensical term. They say, we're anti-racist, which doesn't mean not racist.
It doesn't mean not racist.
It literally means be racist. And then they say diverse, which also is just another, diversity, inclusivity, and equity are just more buzzwords that don't really make a lot of sense. And then that's the halfway.
Right.
After they burned all to the ground, what they want is probably, moral authoritarianism. They have control. They can have whatever they want. You go live in the gutter.
I think that's really interesting, too. And I think conservatives pushed away from having any sort of moral compass after the 90s Christian right takeover of Congress with Newt Gingrich and all of those guys. And the conservatives were pretty well slammed at that point for having a moral perspective and having it be a Christian moral perspective and having that be oppressive and the wrong thing to do. And after that, conservatives embraced relativism in a very real way. The liberals were embracing relativism. Anything you do is fine if that's what you want to do, which to a certain extent, there's nothing for it. People are going to do what they want to do, whether you want to judge them for it or not. But the conservatives left a vacuum of moral authority and of moral perspective. And it's been filled with something that has actually no basis, right? So if you look at, for example, let's take a religious moral perspective, you could have the 10 Commandments in there, right? That could be a basis upon which you're making determinations. You could use the Beatitudes in the Gospel according to Matthew as a basis to make determinations, which is basically be really kind, you guys, right? But when we look at the contemporary leftist moral framework, there's no foundation. There's no basis.
I agree.
So it's just this shifting sands of a value system that is whatever you want it to be whenever you want it to be it, so long as you can use it to maintain your own power.
It's like a hologram.
Yeah.
It's like a hologram of a religion.
Right.
I was reading this book a long time ago. I don't know how true any of this stuff is. It was like a book on quantum physics. And they talked about how the chemical properties of an element, Ian, this is probably up your alley. A chemical property of an element is based on the amount of electrons. Is that so hydrogen is 1, helium is 2.
Yeah.
And so they said something interesting happened when they were working on circuit boards when an electron got trapped in, this one part of the board where there's, and I'm probably totally ruining this concept. Maybe you guys listening understand what this is. I was reading a book, this is like 10 years ago. They said they were sending electrons through, pathways in a circuit board. And they had an area where basically the electron got stuck in a small space and it began to orbit nothing. But it began to exude the chemical properties of hydrogen with no nucleus.
Oh, interesting.
And so I think about that again, more up Ian's alley in this regard, but it's vaguely similar in that that's what I feel like we have with critical race theory. Mm-hmm. It's missing the nucleus core component of a real moral framework. Mm-hmm. Like, you can disagree with religions and what these people believe, but there's, like, as you mentioned, a foundation to where these ideas come from, how they've persisted this long. Bad ideas go away, good ideas remain, become stronger. And then you look at woke, and it's hollow.
Well, it's
like a
because
hologram.
there's no synthesis, right? There's only woke. There's only this critical race system or this gender critical, not gender critical. That's a little different.
There's critical theory.
Critical theory.
Well, let me point something out real quick too. I am partly bothered by how many people just keep saying critical race theory over and over again, ignoring critical gender theory.
That's part of it too. But
critical theory as a whole.
Critical theory,
this network.
and the problem is that because the way that it's constructed in society, you can broach these ideas, but you can't broach any opposition to them, because if you broach opposition to them, then there's something wrong with you, and you are, a racist or transphobic or whatever the other things are that you could be labeled. You're a bigot in some sense of the word. But unless these critical theories are challenged, there's no synthesis to the better idea. They just stand there on their own, and they need to be challenged. We need to challenge every idea that we have, and we need to be challenging our ideas all the time.
Thanks for checking out this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast. If you want to see the full show, come back to this channel, youtube.com/TimcastIRL, Monday through Friday at 8 p.m., where you can leave comments and super chat, and we actually will read your comments on the show. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and if you want exclusive members-only content, segments you can't get anywhere else, go to timcast.com, become a member, and we even have full bonus episodes. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all next time.